I request Mr. Martin Zubek for his paper on a case study of Astapar.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really privileged to be here on behalf of the International Finance Corporation and share our experience in structuring and implementation of PPPs worldwide. I was initially planning to have one presentation on a particular case study, but some discussions last night over dinner prompted me to include a couple of slides explaining who IFC actually is, what we do, and how do we fit into the context of the World Bank Group. So very quickly, IFC is part of the World Bank Group. We are the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. So while the World Bank finances governments, or finances particular government programs in health, education, and other areas, IFC finances private sector on one hand, and it helps governments structure and implement projects that will ultimately attract private sector investment. I come from the PPP Transaction Advisory Group. In that department, what we do is essentially we advise governments and other state-owned institutions on how to structure and implement PPP projects. As have been mentioned several times by previous speakers, there are many projects don't get financed, and the primary reason why projects don't get financed is because they're badly structured. So before our financing colleagues can step into the picture and finance a project, it needs to be a good project. It needs to be properly structured, and that's what we do. That's what we help governments and state-owned institutions to do. We act as a neutral partner. We have the role of an honest broker. We very often work on pioneering transactions in frontier markets. We are very mindful of the social and environmental considerations. We are probably the only multilateral organization offering direct advisory services to governments and state-owned institutions. And also, it needs to be noted that we only work in developing markets, right? At the same time, if you look at the financing business of IFC, we are the world's largest financier of private sector in developing markets. As I mentioned before, we are part of the World Bank Group together with MIGA, the World Bank, which consists of IBRD and IDA. As has been mentioned several times before, PPP stands for Public-Private Partnership. Many governments, many state institutions tend to think that PPP stands for Private Player Pays. That's not true. The most critical word in the PPP structure is the word partnership. If the partnership's not there, the whole thing falls apart. What we try to do is to advise governments on structuring and implementation of PPPs that can actually bring the two parties together by sharing the risk in the most proper manner in context of a particular project. What is the impact of our work? Up until late last year, we have helped over 35 million people to get first-time or improved access to basic services. We have mobilized more than 3 billion in private investment, and we have managed to mobilize more than $2 billion US dollars in fiscal benefits for our client governments. Our track record spreads around various areas. We do projects in many sectors. We work in agribusiness, in health. Power is one of the key areas where we have a lot of projects. Transportation, of course, and water and sanitation is becoming increasingly important in our work. So that's a quick introduction of our institution. and I suggest that we move on to a concrete example of how we can advise and help governments in doing what they're supposed to do when it comes to PPPs. So let me use the example of a hydropower PPP project that we worked on and closed a couple of years ago. It was in Albania. First of all, when we talk about hydro PPPs, it needs to be noted that there are some specific characteristics of hydropower that make it very different from all other PPP projects and also from all other power projects, right? First of all, hydropower is very much site-specific. I mean, it's always said in hydro that the site is the king, not the cash is the king, the site is the king. The projects have high front-end costs. It costs a lot of money to build hydros, then the operating costs later on are relatively low because the water is either for free or there's a small concession fee that needs to be paid. In contrast, when you have a gas-fired plant or coal-fired plant, those are cheaper to build, more easy to build, but then there's a significant operation cost component because you have to pay for fuel. There's difficulty in structuring EPC contracts because there's a lot of uncertainty when you go and launch an EPC tender, right? You have certain hydrological, seismological, geological data, but there's a lot of uncertainty that can only materialize once you start the construction. There's usually a little bit of a conflict between the interest of the system operator and the private developer. What does the private developer want? He wants to make money. And what does the government want? The government wants to optimize its hydropower resources. The private sector guy, he thinks, okay, I want to squeeze out every single drop of the water in the river, right? The government wants to optimize the entire cascade or the entire river basin. There's unusually high construction risk. You can start your construction 2 weeks down the road, you hit some moving clays or hit some archaeological elements or findings, and then your project gets delayed for months and the investment cost increases dramatically. There's hydrological risk. Hydrology is evolving over years and hydrological conditions in general are deteriorating, so one has to bear that in mind. Hydropower is extremely environmentally sensitive. There's usually a lot of expropriation involved, especially in case of large dams. One has to be very careful about safety, social issues, floods that may occur later on, and this comes with a significant price tag. There are financing constraints. Hydros are heavily capital intensive. There's a high proportion of local cost and long payback periods. That's why in many cases, it's difficult to find investors that are willing to assume those risks at the very beginning. So what we're seeing are strong industrial sponsors or strategic sponsors taking a lot of that risk in the beginning in form of equity risk, and once the construction has started and certain milestones have been achieved, then they approach financial institutions to refinance, and then the financial institutions feel a little more comfortable about some of those risks because they see that progress has been made, and then they're more keen to provide cheap financing. There's a lot of regulatory issues involved. We have talked about the overall basin plan or overall cascade management. There are issues with respect to how water concessions are awarded. There's many jurisdictions where hydros are developed. Many of them are very different from each other. In some of them you have transparent competitive tenders for every single project. In some of them you have a streamlined procedure for smaller hydros. One has to look at the specifics of each individual country before structuring the tender documents. Market risk. Is there demand for power in the country? If so, what is the structure of the demand? Do people need more base power or peak power? If there is enough demand in the country, then who is going to be your off-taker? Who will be buying power from your project? And is that entity creditworthy? Do they have the financial strength to pay for your power? If not, what are the other options? Can you export power to neighboring countries? What are the rules governing market access and other things? So these are some of the hydro-specific issues. Almost no PPP activity in the country whatsoever. They had implemented only one PPP, which was the Tirana airport. They had no concession law, no PPP law, nothing. The inflow of foreign investment was very, very low. Question? Yes? Okay.
What is the capacity of the hydro project?
This one, this particular one, well, we'll get there. We'll get there. But we work on all sorts of hydropower projects, from 10 megawatts to, I don't know, 800 megawatts.
No, like different sites you said, like Niagara is a big one, but we have many small ones here. Public-private partnership works. Maybe you have a small fall there which you want to generate. So that might lead to that will be a better public-private partnership than a huge one which we don't have. I mean, I'm just thinking on this.
Okay, I mean, look, generally speaking, without diverting too much from the focus of the presentation, there can be a relatively standardized procedure for hydropower with an installed capacity of up to 10 or 20 megawatts, right? Those are usually easier to implement. There can be standard documents, standard processes that can be followed. I mean, those are relatively easy, right? Again, depending on the site. Then, based on our own experience, as soon as you hit a certain critical installed capacity, then a particular tailor-made approach is required to structure that project, right? So going back to our example, the Albanian government came to us and said, please, help us do something about it. We want to have a new legislation that will fuel the growth of foreign investment in Albania. We want to grow PPPs. We want to bring more international investors to our country, and then create a new image of Albania as a country that is, friendly to foreign investment. What we did was a little bit unusual. We don't usually do it. First of all, we looked at the existing legislation and we drafted a brand new PPP law, because what was there back then was simply, too difficult to work with. So we drafted a brand new concession law right from the start, and that's something we normally don't do. This is what the World Bank does and many other international institutions. We are the transaction people. Then we also help them to establish a PPP unit within the Ministry of Economy. Again, that's something that we don't typically do. We don't do capacity building and things like that. There are other institutions that do it. And then we help them bring a pilot PPP project to the market and guide them through the entire process. We structured the project to them and implemented it. And that PPP project, that pilot PPP project, was the Ashta hydropower plant. It was roughly 48 megawatts of installed capacity. In the end, it was a little higher. It's a long-term concession with a private partner for the construction operation of the hydropower plant in Ashta. The bidding criterion there was the lowest tariff offered to the government of Albania. The investment cost was, it ended up being relatively high, but then we'll talk about this in more detail and I'll tell you why. The project, just going very quickly into some technical details, the project is on the Drin River in northern Albania. On that river, you have 98% of Albania's power generation, right? This is the most downstream plant on the river, which means that it's at the total mercy of whatever's happening upstream, right? If they release too much water, too bad, you get flooded. If there's not enough water going down, too bad, you don't generate power. and that has some specifics. Then also, in the 70s, Albania was in a short marriage with China, and the Chinese back then looked at the project and they developed it into a conceptual stage. So there was a structure developed by the Chinese which had roughly 73 megawatts of installed capacity. When we looked at it, and this is again one of the benefits of IFC or the World Bank Group, when we looked at it from the environmental and social point of view, we determined that it was not sustainable. And why not? Let's look at the picture. If you look at the picture, the initial Chinese alternative wanted to take the water from the irrigation intake, then they wanted to build a Bushati powerhouse over there, and then a long tailrace canal bringing the water back to the Buna River, and then the Buna River goes into the Adriatic Sea. Now, what needs to be noted is that you have this Škodra Lake, or Skadarsko jezero, Skadarski Lake, which is shared between Montenegro and Albania. With this alternative, you would have taken the water away from here and brought it back here, not bringing it back to the Škodra Lake, right? And that would have impacted the level of water in the lake, making the fishermen unhappy, creating a lot of environmental damage, and so on and so forth. So what we did, we downscaled the project, we built a new powerhouse over there, where you see the dotted line, and we brought back the water to the Drin River before it reaches the Škodra Lake. So by doing that, we avoided those environmental concerns, and we managed to implement the project in a sustainable way. What were some of the key structuring issues? First of all, we asked the government, what do you want? I mean, in Albania back then, there were severe power shortages. The country didn't have enough power, right? So we asked them, what do you want? Do you want a maximum installed capacity, or do you want the cheapest power? Because, the cost per megawatt of installed capacity curve is U-shaped, right? So as you keep on adding installed capacity, the cost per kilowatt hour goes down, but once you hit the bottom, as you keep on adding more capacity, the cost goes up. So we asked the government, do you want the maximum that can be built there, or do you want the cheapest power? And that was a very significant question for the government. So after a lot of thinking, the government decided that they wanted the cheapest power possible, while keeping a minimum installed capacity of roughly 40 megawatts. Then the question was, okay, well, do you want the future investor to sell the power on the open market, or are you willing to offtake the entire production and also provide the necessary guarantees? They said, okay, since we want the cheapest power, we'll be happy to offtake the entire production, and then we'll distribute it to the people locally. Risk allocation was a key element. In the beginning, the government said, we are not willing to assume any risk whatsoever, right? Hydrology risk, expropriation, everything the private sector has to deal with. That's not the way how it works. I mean, usually the governments are better placed in dealing with some of those risks than the private sector. So after a lot of iteration, in the end, we ended up with a fair risk allocation matrix. Another issue was related to the power purchase agreement. Since the state-owned power utility was the off-taker under the PPA, it was not, the utility was not in the healthiest financial condition, so to say, so there were some guarantees required to make sure that they can honor their payment obligation. I'll skip the discussion on the EU limitations because they are very region-specific. Again, cascade coordination